Welcome to this special edition of the New Stack Makers on the road for KubeCon EU 2022 in Valencia, Spain. Discussions from the show floor with technologists giving you the expertise and insights that will help you in your everyday work.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jennifer Riggins, the culture correspondent at the New Stack, and here we are at KubeCon EU in the beautiful city of Valencia. How are you doing today? Please introduce yourself and tell us how you're doing.
Absolutely. My name is Matty Stratton. I'm a staff developer advocate at Pulumi, and I'm really excited to be at, this is my second KubeCon in person, and it is my first time in Valencia / also in Spain, and in my first KubeCon EU in person. So.
Ooh, well, I hope you have time to stay later because
Yes.
Spain is
well,
a wonderful
I came early.
country.
I did not staying later, so yeah.
Excellent choice. So for those that don't know Pulumi, let's give a quick rundown of what Pulumi is and why would the lovely listeners out there on the interweb care?
Absolutely.
Who would like to care?
So Pulumi is, universal infrastructure as code. And when we think about infrastructure as code, it's a way of, we're building out resources, whether they're cloud resources, clusters, things that make applications go, right? Our infrastructure. And we're defining them using some kind of code, some kind of programming, et cetera, et cetera. Well, a lot of times in infrastructure as code, we're using domain-specific language, using a config file, where we call it infrastructure as code, but we're not actually writing any code. So I like to think about Pulumi as infrastructure as software. And what that fundamentally means is when I'm writing Pulumi code, I'm writing it using a general purpose programming language like TypeScript or Python or Go or any of the .NET languages, or as we'll talk about in a minute, Java even, and all of the associated JVM languages. So there's tons of languages. So the great thing about that is not only do you maybe already know this programming language because that's the language you use to build your applications, but you're able to use all the things that a programming language has available to it, like conditionals and loops and packages and testing tools and an IDE and a whole ecosystem, right? So that makes it a lot more powerful and gives us a lot of great abstractions we can do.
And y'all have been around for a bit now. And what types of customers do you usually have? Who is your user and what type of customers are there?
So there's no typical customer, which is
no
great.
Way.
Right, go figure, right? Everybody's different, but every snowflake has 6 sides. What we'll see is there's just because lots of different organizations have different patterns. So when you say what kind of customers do we have, we could talk about just what kinds of companies, and that's across the board. We have large enterprises, we have startups, we have you name it, we are represented somewhere, which is not unsurprising when we talk in emergent tech. We see that across the board. I've been at lots of different places, and I've seen that across. Now, what kinds of teams and folks are using Pulumi within organizations? We see it for sure within your more traditional operations teams who are building out infrastructure on demand, et cetera, like that. But also we see a lot within the kind of you wrote it, you run it teams, the feature teams that are doing their own part of building their own infrastructure, or their parts of the infrastructure, where maybe you have like a central web ops team or cloud ops team or something like that that's building out, or a platform team that's laying down the core infrastructure. But we'll see those patterns where you'll have teams like that, and they'll be using Pulumi, but then the feature team that's writing a service or doing something like that, they're able to build upon that and write their own Pulumi code for the pieces that matter to them.
Okay.
And so we see a lot of, there's different patterns. And I come from a very traditional ops background. I always like to say I spent a couple decades working in tech ops, and now they pay me to talk about it. And so I see folks that come from my background, but I also see software engineering folks. Software engineers really like Pulumi a lot because it's a great glide path for them. They already know JavaScript. They already know Go, right? They already know C#. But now they have to learn cloud, or they have to learn Kubernetes. So at least they only have to learn one thing. They don't have to, so that's always helpful.
Okay. And in the time of no code and low code, do developers or ops even want to be doing this, or do they want this level of control, or do they prefer automation across?
Well, it is a little bit of automation, and I'm also when I think about low code and no code, it's a little less to me about when we're building a service, right? So again, a lot of stuff to me Actually, what was the ultimate, like the original low code to me was Microsoft Access, right?
Oh.
Right? You know what I mean? At the end of the day, that's like kind of how I feel, right? We're enabling people to solve a problem using just enough tech, right? And so that's actually where this kind of comes in. We're kind of going all the way up the stack and saying, we're giving you just enough to be able to accomplish everything that you need to accomplish, but no more than you need. And maybe even not so much no more than you need, no more than you want, right? Like keep it out of the way. So when we think of some of the abstractions we can do with this kind of infrastructure as software, we can take your platform team that are experts in, let's say, how Kubernetes clusters should be built. And they can create a component, which is some type of, basically it's a software package that defines, okay, these are the best practices of our organization of how clusters are. But a development team that wants a cluster, they have two properties that they care about for the cluster. They actually don't want to have to worry about the 150 other things you might have to define and what it means to create a cluster. And so it is a little bit like low code. Yes, it's technically we're writing code, but I'll talk about a feature we just announced that makes it even less code. But you're exposing just enough. And actually, guardrails are great. People like guardrails because it's not about keeping them from doing something they shouldn't. It's being able to focus on what they want to accomplish.
Yeah, the individuals and the governance, the security,
Yep.
A lot of people business side like guardrails too. So from the beginning, you've been calling it a universal IS, but it's only recently universal, right? Is this Polyglot or a lot of new features that are making it more universal, more broad spread and Polyglot,
Well, I
right?
think we've been talking about it being universal very recently. Like this is just sort of our term that we up at, that's kind of how we've started talking about saying it's this universal approach has been more recent in the last couple of, kind of with our new launch. Previously, we referred to it as modern infrastructure as code.
So tell us about the universality
Exactly.
features.
So there's a couple of bits of that, and one we just announced our had a bunch of new features that came out 2 weeks ago. One of which was adding another programming language, and that programming language was Java. And
No one uses that, obviously.
it's been around for a minute. And the thing about Java is it's not just, it's the JVM. So it's every JVM language. So we just added like 14 more programming languages when we did that. So you've got Scala, you've got, Kotlin, you've got all these things. So not only does it give us a broader scope of that, but there's lots of organizations, like you said, lots of organizations with Java expertise. So that really that's really, really powerful. But then almost on the other side of that was we released support for YAML. And yes, YAML it's a language, right? And to a lot of folks are like, well, isn't this not what Pulumi is about? I thought Pulumi was about using general purpose programming languages. Well, what you can do, like, are you going to use YAML to define very complex infrastructure in Pulumi? Probably not. But when we thought about those abstractions and that just enough, so it's almost the low code solution. So if we go back to my example of, I'm the Kubernetes expert in my organization, and maybe I will write in my programming language of choice, maybe it's Go, I'm going to write this component, which is fundamentally a library, that says this is a cluster. And this is all the things, and it's what's all been pre-approved, and security is authorized and said, yes, this is it. So we know. And you can't change it. I mean, I can because I wrote it, but it's in through the thing. But anyone who consumes it, they just part in their part. Well, you know what? Up until 2 weeks ago, you still could do this, but you would bring it into you'd write a TypeScript program. That was a very short TypeScript program because it was create a new object called cluster with these two properties.
Still boring extra work.
Right.
Doesn't add value.
Well, but maybe now you can do
it, yeah.
now you can do it with YAML.
Yeah.
Right? You're just defining that. So it's even more low code because you're like, okay, I don't even have to put any, because I probably in that thing that's assembling those components, I don't really need to do the things that the programming language is giving me. I'm not doing loops. I'm not doing conditionals. I'm not doing all this. I'm just defining I want a thing, right? So the other thing, though, is you may find people also YAML, besides, even if you don't have that situation, maybe you're just sort of getting started with this. You're like, okay, I think I want to do some pretty simple stuff. I can probably define it all in YAML and Pulumi. And then you hit a point and you go, oh, this got more complicated. This is more than YAML could do. We have a thing we call Pulumi, where you can sit and you can eject that YAML that you wrote into another programming language. So you're like, you know what? I was doing this all in YAML. now it's time, you know what, I really would rather do this in Python. So you're not starting from nothing, and then it lets you go and do that. And the thing that's actually the next little bit of powerfulness about this, because of how that conversion works of all of that, it lets anybody do things that maybe I wouldn't recommend to do for real, but they might be fun. One of my colleagues has written a blog post it was like deploying Kubernetes and deploying Kubernetes in ridiculous programming languages. And so he kind of looked at it and said, well, because any programming language that can generate YAML, or fundamentally JSON, can then come into that. So he wrote some Perl to create a Kubernetes cluster. He wrote some Fortran to create a Kubernetes cluster. And it was on Hacker News. And everyone's like, why would you do this? We're like, well, you wouldn't. But it illustrates the point really well, which is whatever kind of thing that gives you that connection. So it gives you a lot of opportunity, a lot of option.
Which is what people want within guardrails, as we said.
Yes. Well, and when you're talking about the guardrails, I just want to give one example. I've heard this from several different organizations that have adopted Pulumi, where they'll be in a scenario where, again, let's use Kubernetes clusters as an example, because this tends to come up a lot. Also, we're KubeCon, so, come on. And where it might normally, okay, I'm a delivery team, I'm a service team somewhere, and I'm like, okay, I want to spin up some infrastructure. Well, everything I want to do has to get approved by security and compliance and all this stuff, and it could take weeks and weeks and weeks. Well, in these organizations, because the Pulumi component that they wrote that says this is what a cluster is with these 4 possible inputs you can change has been approved and stamped, they can just use it. They don't have to go through that process, because it was done by that, because that was codified that way. And it is a huge accelerator in that point. So that's one of the places we've seen a lot of adoption, is just that ability to create those guardrails, and by defining your infrastructure as code. And this is one of the things, to me, I worked at Chef. I was part of the Chef community for a long time, then worked at Chef. And even then, I've always thought, I said, we call it infrastructure as code, but really it's always been infrastructure using code, because we didn't really treat our infrastructure like code itself. But now we sort of are, because we're saying our infrastructure itself are components that have these pieces. So I think it's getting closer to that idea,
where everything is componentized or
codified, or componentized, or commoditized. There's lots of words.
Legos.
They might mean things. Yes, they're just it's all just Legos all the way down.
If you go around, you'll see that. Yeah. So let's just real quick go through and make sure we get the other key features. So everyone
that we've come out with, the new.
Yeah,
we had a lot of really new stuff that it was pretty exciting announcements a couple weeks ago. Some of them are a little, I don't want to say a little more esoteric, but like if you, I almost want to say if you know, you know. But I'll explain why they matter, because you might not know without starting. One thing is we've had a feature that we call AWS Crosswalk, and what that is it's really a set of libraries and reference components for building things in AWS. So if you might think about, okay, if I'm going to set up a certain, like a Fargate cluster, I'm also going to need a VPC. There's a bunch of stuff that all goes together. Well, I don't, it's kind of a pain to sit there and have to write the code to do all those things. Well, in Crosswalk, we kind of know what the things you're going to need. So it basically creates almost like a super resource that contains all those things, makes it way easier. So, but up until 2 weeks ago, it was only available in TypeScript. And as someone who was learning Pulumi a little over a year ago, because he joined Pulumi to be a developer advocate, but likes Go, was like, oh, well, I'm going to look at the tutorial we have for this thing, but write it in Go. And then like, oh, this is a lot more to do so the big announcement was Crosswalk is now available in every supported Pulumi programming language. So that's powerful. And then we are going to continue to work on making that available for other things like Azure and GCP. We have similar things like that for Kubernetes already. If you're familiar with the AWS CDK, which is, again, like very similar to Pulumi, where you can use programming languages to then work with CloudFormation. So all of those things created in CDK, you can now actually leverage in Pulumi. So you can use the Pulumi authoring experience and execution engine with all of the great resources that exist for CDK, but not use CloudFormation and its limitations that people bump their head against sometimes.
Okay.
So it's a better together, it's an interop story, and that's really exciting. And those are some of the main ones we've done. I know those are the ones that mostly come to mind for me. And then really the YAML piece is what comes in a lot. We also have a preview coming of what we call our native provider for Google Cloud. So we have a couple different ways we build providers, and providers are just how do we talk to a resource we want to do. And what we call a native provider is one where it's generated according to the API spec that the cloud provider provides themselves, as opposed to having to go in and say, like, what does this do? So we've had a native provider for Azure and for Kubernetes for a while. And what that does is, for example, we'll use Azure as the example, because Azure publishes their API spec. And we build our provider nightly. So when there's a new resource available or new properties on a resource, they're available in Pulumi within 24 hours, automatically, with none of us having to write a line of code. And so we're able to start doing that with AWS when they release the Cloud Control API, and then Google GCP has a similar API coming that we're working with. So those are continuing to add. And then Kubernetes is there because it's always very well
all
published.
the things.
Also, it's all the things. Kubernetes is all the things to all the people, whether they want it or not.
Yep, and whether they get it or not.
Yeah.
Well, this has been great. It's very clear that Pulumi is moving in the direction of giving more choice to the developer or the ops teams, but also in your current customers, it allows more people in an organization to adopt the benefits without having to change the way they work.
Correct. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And I've been part of the DevOps community for a long time, and all that I want to see out of DevOps and all of this work is how do we collaborate better together? How do we be more cross-functional? And that's why this all makes a lot of sense to me.
Okay, we're on day one of real KubeCon. What do you hope to get out of it real quick?
Really what I love to, this is the same thing I always have for any conference, is it's, and people say this is the hallway track. I think there are a lot of great talks. What I'm hoping to get out of it is actually like the time turner that Hermione Granger had, because there's a lot of talks that happen at the same time that I want to see. And then also a lot of talks that happen at the time when I have to do something else. But I'm really hoping to sort of talk to folks about what they've seen and what resonated to them, because that, to me, like seeing through the lens of others, helps me understand what we can do in the industry. But I also am really hoping to get out of this seeing people who I think are great speakers and great people that have awesome information, and seeing them being able to share that with people who maybe have never had that shared with them before. And that's what's awesome about events like this.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. High five. Thank you.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.